I'm getting the thumbs up from Forrest. So Forrest, when you're trimming it, when you see this, it's okay to. That's the beginning of it. Or you'll leave it in. That's fine. So we are in Hebrews chapter 12. We're in the application portion of the book. So remember, the book was originally written, this letter was written to Christians who are facing persecution. They're facing difficulty, they're facing struggle, trial, tribulation, whatever you want to say, and they're starting to suffer. Their faith is starting to suffer because of it. We're seeing warnings against drifting away. We're seeing warnings against being negligent in their faith. We're seeing warnings that they're not growing in their understanding of the Word. So the trials, the hardships that they're facing are affecting their faith, and their faith is starting to suffer. The way that the author prepares the book is the first section is reminding them of who the Son is. The Son of God, He's the Creator, that angels are subservient to Him, that there's all this great power and majesty and deity wrapped up in the individual of the Son, of the Messiah, of the Christ, of Jesus. The second section of the book is His role as a high priest, reminding that a high priest serves as a mediator between God and man, that the high priest serves the people who are serving God, who are worshiping God. So we see this amazing being, this amazing person, and the role that He's in for us. And then beginning in chapter 11 is the application portion of the book. Now what? Because of who He is, because of what He does. Now, what's our responsibility? What's our response to that? And we see that, we transition into that in chapter 10 and verse 39. We are not of those who draw back to destruction, but we're those who believe to the saving of the soul. It's kind of an encouragement. We don't give up this valuable thing that we have. We don't draw away from it. We press on. We believe. We have faith. We have trust, all the way to the saving of the soul. And then last week we looked at, or the last 2 weeks we've looked at chapter 11, the Hall of Fame of Faith, all these people who were faithful. We see that wrapped up in verse 39 of chapter 11. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. That gets us to where we're going to start today. We're starting in chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. That's one paragraph. That's one sentence. We're gonna break it apart here in just a sec. So, therefore, because we're not of those who draw back to destruction in 1039, because of these examples that we have of these people who pressed forward, even though they didn't realize the promise of God. They were pressing forward, they were being faithful, looking forward to a promise that still remained out there for them. Therefore, we also, that little word also, ties the recipients of the letter into these heroes that we looked at in the previous chapter. It ties us as recipients of this book in with them. We also, these people pressed forward. These people had faith. These people had trust. Remember in chapter 11, verse 39, they obtained a good testimony through their faith, even though they did not receive the promise. Did we receive? Have we received a lot of promises? Yeah. Have we received all the promises? What's one that remains? Eternal life. What was over here? So we looked at this, well, in real time. We looked at this months ago. But remember in chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, since a promise remains of entering His rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to come short of it. So we also have to trust that God's going to be faithful to what He says. that he's promised us this other rest, that he's promised us this other reward. We're pressing forward to that, just like these people that we just looked at pressed forward for a promise. So therefore, because of this, we also, just like them, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, who are these witnesses that we're surrounded by? The folks we saw in chapter 11, which include Enoch, who was so faithful that God just took him, didn't even let him die, he took him. Abel, who was faithful in how he served God. David and Samuel and all these Moses and Abraham and Jacob, all these people that we look to as faithful men, maybe not Samson, maybe not Jacob always, but they're surrounding us and they're watching us run our race. How does that make you feel?
Well, you know how you kind of laughingly said Samson and Jephthah, and I think that what that does is that gives us a hope that I can be in that list too.
Okay.
I mean, we see that no one mentioned there was perfect. I mean, Enoch seems pretty close, and that
Just because we don't read enough about him.
yeah, and so, but when we do see people like Samson, people like Jephthah, that did some things that were a bit rash or stumbled and fell, but we see that they got back up. It gives us hope.
Okay. So we can get hope because these are imperfect people who we see were also faithful to God in spite of their imperfection. So that gives us hope that I know I'm imperfect. I'm assuming the rest of you are imperfect. We can be faithful to God too. What else? What impact does it have that we have these people watching us?
Reminds me of my sports days, and you're working out, and you're trying to get those last few, and the rest of the people are all around you, come on, you can make it, you can make it. That type of feeling
Right.
for me at least.
Okay, so Dave's example, I'm assuming in the gym, you're trying to get those last few reps in, or
Yeah, practice or whatever it is.
okay. Now, who's cheering you on when you're doing that? Who are the people who are watching? Are they just people like me who are out of shape and never really were in shape or that athletic or anything, and they're like, come on? Or are they people that have accomplished what you're trying to accomplish?
The rest of my teammates, they finished, and I'm catching up.
Yeah. So Dave's the last one, and everyone else who's finished.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's apply that. And I feel like sometimes I'm that last Christian, and everybody else has got this down. But they're surrounding us. They're surrounding us, watching us, and watching us run this race. And they're ones who have finished. They're ones who we've told have finished it the way that they're supposed to have finished. And they're watching us. I think that's powerful. That it's not just random people in the stands. Jesse and I watched a soccer game last night. I can't play soccer. Jesse can't play soccer at the level of the folks that we watched. But it's not like those people are performing in a mostly empty stadium, and there's people like me who don't really count, who don't really, in that instance, who don't really count. But it's as if those people were playing a game in front of Hall of Fame soccer players. Okay, we've got to pay attention to the little things. We've got to be diligent in what we do. We've got to work hard, because these people who know what they're doing are now observing how we behave, how we run this race. I think it's a really powerful image that those people who are in heaven, who have been faithful, are now watching us. There's almost some pressure there. There's some encouragement there, certainly, but it really draws attention to how I behave. So we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. Rich used the word martyrs, and in my studies on this, my limited studies on this, the word witness comes from the same base word as the word that we see martyrs for. But when we see translations of that word that is here, witnesses, it's consistently witnessed throughout the scriptures. So it is the same root of the word martyr, so there is some connection there. But these are witnesses. These are people who are watching. So since we're surrounded by these people who are watching, these accomplished, rewarded people who are watching, let us lay aside every weight. Let us lay aside the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So let's look at the sin first. If we're going to run faithfully for God, should we lay aside sin? Will sin trip us up? Do we need to elaborate on this anymore? So what's this other weight that we need to lay aside? It says we need to lay aside every weight and the sin which ensnares us. So these other weights, are they necessarily inherently sinful that could trip us up? So what could they, if they're not, then what could they be? Distractions? Mark, you had a hand up?
Well, I think about how, especially at this time, we go back to the concept of anxiety and fear. These are things that are ever present pretty much all the time, but you get to decide how directly your anxieties and your own fears get to run your heart and your mind.
Okay.
And so is the mere fact that these things exist sin in and of itself? No. What is sin is how you allow it to draw you away from God.
Okay. So anxiety and fear could certainly trip us up, can certainly draw us away, create a stumbling block. Mindel?
The thing that came to mind to me was what he was referring to in the previous chapter, which is where he's saying all of these people were faithful to God even though they hadn't gotten the promise fulfilled yet. They weren't given, the rewards. It's delayed gratification. We're working now, we're laying off the sin, we're working for God now, even though we're not getting the ultimate reward immediately.
Okay.
We're waiting for it. So you need to hold on to that hope that all of these witnesses can give us.
Okay.
Hold on to that and let go of that, worry that you're not going to get the promise, now.
Okay, so worry and doubt because we haven't fully realized our reward of heaven. What about jobs? We don't get to eat if we don't work, right? But can that be something that ensnares us? Family. We're supposed to love our family. Can family ensnare us? Friendships, entertainment, really anything in this world, and this I think boils down to a judgment matter. Anything in this world that can ensnare us, we have to push it aside. We have to lay it aside. Now remember, these people are facing persecution. These people are facing outright persecution, which we'll look at a little bit later in this chapter. Would that be something that could trip us up in our faithful race? Who here is worried about some of the decisions being made by the earthly leaders, either national leaders or state leaders or county leaders or city leaders, and the impact they have on our ability to assemble and worship and sing and all these things? Who here has fear about some of those things? Yeah? Can that trip us up? Absolutely. So what do we do with it? We have to push it aside. Regardless of whatever, I'm not going to deal with that so it won't hinder me with this race. So we set aside sin, obviously. We set aside anything else that can distract us, that can trip us, and we run with endurance. That word endurance is like patience. It's steadfastness. I'm going to be steady and constant in doing this. We're not. It's not a huge. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. Do people who've run marathons or half marathons, not me, or any kind of distance race, do you need patience when you run that race? Yeah. Because what happens if you start really, really, really fast and then burn yourself out? Then you can't finish. we're being diligent in how we run. We're being thoughtful in how we run. So we're running with endurance, we're running with patience, we're running with steadfastness. In verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. We just finished spending 40 verses looking at these heroes of faith in the Old Testament. We don't look to them as we run because they're in the stands around us. We're looking at the person who set the course to begin with. We're looking to Jesus, the author. When we see the word author, what do we think of in Hebrews? The one who paved the way, a trailblazer, a scout, the one who goes on ahead. So he, the author, he went on ahead, he set the course that we're running on. Not only that, he's the author and he's the finisher. So he finished it, he perfected it, he completed it, so he marked it out, and then he made it exactly what it needed to be. That's who we're looking at, that's who we're following, the author and finisher of our faith. Why did he do it? For the joy set before him. Think back to Matthew 26, when he's praying in the garden, I really don't want to do this. Is that the joy that was set before him? The outcome and the result. So he was willing to go through that because he had his focus set even farther beyond what he was about to endure. That's how we run. Are we going to face difficulty and probably persecution and all kinds of uncomfortable situations because of our faith? But we have to have joy in that because of the expectation that lies after that. Karen.
I just picture more, when we talk about a race, sometimes you can imagine just like a nice temperature-controlled indoor track or whatever, but several years ago, our daughter did a Spartan race, and it's where you do all the obstacles, and you fall in the mud, and you do the tires, and you fall a wall, and all this, and you shoot, bow and arrow, so any challenge that you couldn't complete, then you had to do 25 burpees or whatever, and all along the way, as people kind of ran it together, they encouraged each other, they helped each other over the wall, whatever, but every obstacle they came to, they had to overcome until they get to the end. And so this race, I always associate with more something like that, where we're always going to hit all these really pretty difficult challenges, and our teammates around us are who help us get to the finish line.
I think that's a great analogy. Now we should all picture our faithful life like a Spartan race. Okay, you got that hurdle. What about this one? What about this one? What about this one? No, that's a great analogy. Thank you. I like that.
And the obstacles, I was thinking what she said too, the obstacles, then if you don't do that, if you don't get through that obstacle, there's consequences to that.
Yeah.
And they're not fun.
Who here likes to do burpees?
No.
Forrest put his hand up. Forrest needs to come forward next Sunday. Yeah, I like to eat a lot and then relieve pressure. That's not what it is.
They're a lot easier at the beginning than at the end.
Yeah. So we're looking to Jesus, the author, the beginner and the finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him. And that joy, I think, we can have too. Regardless of what we face, we have that joy, that same expectation of reward that was set before him. He endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. We've looked before at his posture of sitting down at the right hand of the throne of God. What does it mean to despise the shame, though? Sorry?
He hated it.
He hated it? Well, what shame did he endure? Just think of his last 24 hours before he died. That he was rejected by his own, that the people he came to save arrested him, mocked him. He was beaten by Pilate, beaten to the point where Pilate presented him and said, look, hasn't he suffered enough? And they said, no, crucify him anyway. When they crucified him, he carried his cross, or a portion of his cross, out of town, up the hill. They crucified him naked. And while they did that, people are going by and making fun of him while he's hanging from a cross, and the way people died on the cross is through suffocation. Hanging there naked publicly as a warning for everyone who comes into and out of town, don't break the law here because this is the end result. That was the shame that he faced. So to despise it, if you despise something, do you hold any value for that thing that you're despising? No. So when he despised it, it's like he disregarded it. He treated that shame as something that I have no care for. I have no regard for. That it was kind of worthless to him. It had no impact on him. So again, that's how he ran. That's how he focused his life. I'm going through all this horrible stuff, but I'm looking beyond it. I don't care about this shame. I don't care about this suffering, because I'm focused on something that's so much greater beyond. Mental.
The last phrase basically what I was going to say. It's just that the joy was so much better that the shame almost, disappeared in its insignificance compared. Is how I follow that sense. It's scorning the shame.
Yeah, it has no value compared to this other thing. Now, don't raise your hands. Have we ever felt shamed? Maybe not shame ourselves, but have we received shame for others because of our faith? Because of the decisions and how we've chosen to live our life. I can't do this thing because I have an assembly, or I have a Bible class, or I'm not going to participate in that because I don't do those things because of the decisions that I've made and where my commitments are. We receive shame all the time. Directly, indirectly, people can mock us, people can just, I don't understand that, which belittles the decisions that we've made. How do we value that shame? It's something that we have to choose. So, looking to Jesus, we're despising the shame, and he is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Anything on that first paragraph?
I'm just thinking about the despising shame and joy, that a lot of times I think maybe we don't personalize this, that the result of that is the salvation of people. And we might think, well, it's sitting at the right hand of God, or something that came after that that is unique, just to his own personal benefit. But it wasn't that at all. His joy was that human beings would be saved through this thing, and he was willing to do it because of human beings being saved.
Right. Well, if we're going to minimize Jesus' joy to being at the right hand of the throne of God, we forget what we looked at in the first part of the book. Where did Jesus start? At the right hand of the throne of God. And he came here to subject himself to that and it's not, don't even think us. Because it's easy to say, I'm going to suffer for all of them. But he came for me. And he came for Mendel. And he came for Jen. And he came for, Roberta, Dave. And he came for... But like Dave was saying, if we personalize that, does that not feel like it has a lot more impact? Okay. So, despising the shame is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Next paragraph, in verse 3, for, we're still talking about how we run and where our focus is. Our focus is on how we run. For, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. For you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So, verse 3, consider him who endured such hostility from sinners. This word consider, it gives more depth and focus and attention than what we, I think of when we just see the word consider. Yeah, I've kind of considered it. No, it means really sit down and consider it. Meditate on this. Contemplate this. Really sit down and think about it. Really sit down and think about him, Christ, and the nature that we see of him in the first two sections of this letter, who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. Think about who he was, think about what he did, think about what he faced, and really meditate on it, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. They were becoming weary and discouraged in their souls, and we do too, based on what we see around us, based on what we see happening to us, right? We get discouraged, we get frustrated, we feel tired. But often is that because we're just focused on us? He's saying, don't just focus on yourself, focus on him. Consider him who endured such, the stuff that we looked at, hostility from sinners against himself. Look at what he went through. And then look at what you're going through. Focus on him so you don't become weary and discouraged. Verse 4, because you've not yet resisted to bloodshed. What does it mean you haven't yet resisted to bloodshed? You're still alive. You haven't died yet. What are you whining about? Jesus died. If you've watched the old Kevin Costner Robin Hood movie, there's a scene where you've got Kevin Costner and you've got Morgan Freeman. And Morgan Freeman goes over here and he's praying, and Kevin Costner goes off and gets in trouble, and people are fighting him, and he's like, hey, come help me, come help me, come help me. And Morgan Freeman keeps praying. And afterwards, it's early in the movie, so Kevin Costner wins, of course. But he goes back and he says, what are you doing? I asked you for help. You said you would help me, and you're not here. And Morgan Freeman just kind of claps him on the shoulder and says, you whine like a mule. You're still alive. That's what he's saying here. Hey, you're still alive. You haven't suffered to this point yet. You haven't striven against sin like Jesus did. You haven't resisted to your death like Jesus did. Compare those differences. And you've forgotten the exhortation. So before we get to verse 5, anything in verses 3 or verse 4? Okay. Verse 5, you've forgotten this. And then he goes back and he quotes Proverbs chapter 3. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord. Who's got a different word than chastening?
Discipline.
Okay. Chastening and discipline. What does that make us think of? Spanking. Or grounding, if you're more woke, enlightened, thank you. I couldn't get the right word. So we think of punishment. When we think of chastening, we think of punishment. When we think of discipline, we think of punishment. Now look at the root words of these. So if we're taking discipline, if we shorten that to its root word, what's the root word of discipline? Disciple. So parents, think about when you discipline your kids. You're trying to train them into what you want them to be. So when we as Christians face discipline, we're facing training. And I think that's what we need to consider here in this chapter. Now, chastening also is the same thing. We think of discipline. We think of punishment. Well, I'm using discipline wrong. We're thinking of punishment. Chastening, if we shorten that to the root word, it means we're really to make something chaste, to make something pure, to make something virtuous. So when we see this quote in verse 5, you've forgotten this encouragement, this exhortation. Don't despise the chastening, the discipline of the Lord, that the Lord is trying to train us up into what he wants us to be. This persecution that they're facing, it's part of the training of the Lord. It's part of making us stronger. It's part of maturing us and developing us. It's not punishment. It's not a punishment for their faith. It's a strengthening of their faith. Dave, did you put a hand up?
He's reminding them too of who they are, that they're sons. You care about your sons. God cares about you.
Right.
If you don't care, you don't want to go discipline. I want to discipline that kid in the street that's somebody else's kid. I don't care. I care about my kids.
Right.
And he's reminding them, you're his kids, you're his sons, and he loves you. That's why he's doing this.
Right. Now, have they lost sight of that? This is hard. I don't want to do it. I'm letting my faith drift that we saw in chapter 2. I'm not focusing like we see in chapter 5. We've stopped assembling with other saints like we see in chapter 10. But it's because they're viewing this as something hard, not something that is strengthening them for future joy. Because, like Dave said, because they're sons of God. My son, don't despise the training of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you're rebuked by him, when you're corrected by him. If we're doing something wrong, don't we want to be corrected so we can do it right? Yeah, don't be discouraged when you get that. It's part of the relationship that we have with the Father. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, he trains, and he scourges, he corrects every son whom he receives. He's loving us as a father loves a son, and he's training us to what he wants us to be, like a father should be doing to their children. If, verse 7, if you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father doesn't chasten? So, fathers, if you have kids, should you be training them? What happens if you don't? They run amok. So I've got a cousin whose parents did not train him. He dropped out of school in junior high. He's been in and out of jail for his entire life since he dropped out of school in junior high. In and out of jail, homeless consistently, perpetually on drugs. And he's a sharp guy. He was such a clever kid. But because he never got training, look at the life that he's in now. Because maybe it was easy for his parents. I don't know what really went on in that house. But he wasn't treated as a son. He wasn't trained up to be who he should be. He just didn't get what he needed. So if you endure this training, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom the father does not chasten, discipline, train? We should have that. We expect that. But if you are without chastening, in verse 8, of which all have become partakers, have all of God's children received some sort of training? Yeah, that's what he says. If you're without chastening, training, of which all have become partakers. What's this word? When you see the word partaker, think sharer, think fellowship, because that's what it means. So, if all the children of God have fellowship with discipline, if all the children of God have shared in discipline, training up, and you haven't, then what does that mean? You're not a son. You're illegitimate in verse 8 and not sons. So if we are children of God, do we expect to share in our share of discipline, of chastening, of training up? Yeah, because if we don't get it, if we don't strengthen our faith the way God wants us to strengthen our faith, then we're illegitimate and not sons. It's like we don't have a dad because we're not being trained up the way that we should be trained up. Furthermore, just like this, we've had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? Or to the Father of spirits and live. So we've got human fathers. Do we respect our human fathers to some degree or another? Yeah. Brittany says no. Rich was looking down. So if our human fathers tried to train us up, and we respect them for what they did. Now, who here has a human father who didn't correct them, discipline them, chasten them, scourge them, like it says in verse 6? Yeah, I think all or most of us had human fathers who made things uncomfortable for us at one time or another. Owen's raising his hand. Hunter's not paying attention to that. But we still respect those human fathers. Now he's saying, you've got the Father of spirits. You've got the Father of all. And when he's trying to do it, you're saying it's too tough and you want to give it up? No, shall we not much more readily be in subjection, pay that same respect to that Father and live? For they indeed, in verse 10, for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. So, did our human fathers ever mess up? Bailey and Morgan, no, but did our human fathers mess up? Were they still doing their best? Yeah. It says they, for a few days, chastened us. For a little while, they chastened us as seemed best to them. They did their best. But he, this Father of spirits, for our profit. Always for our profit. Whatever he did, it was for good. And he doesn't mess up like our human father does. So that we can be partakers, sharers in fellowship with his holiness. Where we see in 1 Peter that we need to be holy because he is holy. He trains us up in that holiness if we're his sons. And then verse 11 talks about what Dave was saying. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present. Who here enjoys being dressed down or corrected or punished? None of that seems joyful for the present, but painful, obviously. Nevertheless, afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. It gets us where we need to be. This word peaceful peaceable can also be profitable. It puts us to the point where we need to be. Who enjoys going to the gym? Who enjoys starting going to the gym? Think about it. We're almost to January 1st, right? If you can get into a gym in January, a lot of people are going to say, my New Year's resolution is to get in shape, right? And those of you who go to gyms regularly hate January, right? Because it's crowded and people don't know what they're doing, and you've got people with fresh nails in their Starbucks and they're fooling around on a machine and they don't know what it is. Now, come middle of February, they're all going to be gone, right? Because it's hard. So when he says in verse 11, we go to the gym to get our bodies trained up to where we want them to be. Either trained up or slimmed down to where we want them to be. But it's hard. If we don't discipline our body, if we don't chasten our body, if we don't train our body, we're not going to get those results. And it's not pleasant. It's not enjoyable necessarily. But we don't get that profitable fruit, that peaceable fruit, if we don't do it. Okay, anything else on that paragraph?
It's hard on discipline too. The old saying, this doesn't mean more than it's going to hurt you, is true. But it's hard. You don't want to discipline. You don't want to have to do that to them. But it's important.
It's important to get them. Remember, it's that joy that's set before him. Dave disciplined his kids because he didn't want them to be obnoxious adults. That's that joy that was set before him. Honestly, seeing people with strong-willed kids. You guys had some strong-willed kids? You guys have some strong-willed kids. There's value in seeing the progress that you make, even though there's a lot of pain and suffering on both sides getting to that point. But it's that peaceable profitable fruit once you get through that and have them trained where they should be. Okay, anything else on the first 11 verses of chapter 12? We'll pick up in verse 13, or I'm sorry, in verse 12 next week. We'll finish out chapter 12 next week. And then the last week should be the last week of the year, I think, and then we'll do chapter 13 then. But if there's nothing else, let's have a quick prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we're grateful that you've given us this chance to study your word. We ask that your truth would always be taught, that we'd be strengthened and encouraged by what we read here, that we'd understand it the way that you intend. Father, we ask that we would take to heart the lessons that you've brought us in this letter, that we wouldn't be fearful of the training that we'll face, because we know if we're your children, you do want us to be stronger, and we will face difficult times in this life, but we need to focus on the reward that you've promised. We'd ask that you'd encourage us in this. We'd ask that our brothers and sisters would encourage one another in this, that we would be who you expect us to be in this life, and that we'd have an expectation of a reward in the next one. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.